One of the biggest controversies I've seen in modern times surrounding Islam is the concept of the 72 virgins, those that according to some beliefs are rewarded to a Muslim upon his reaching of paradise. Whilst the Qur'an doesn't actually ever mention 72 virgins, nor is there any explicit mention of any sexual gratification one might receive from them, various Hadith literature, these being reports of the Prophet Muhammad's words, actions or approvals that are often used to explain or contextualise Quranic verses, are a bit more forthcoming, and in some cases also quite graphic. What's more, some of the hadiths don't seem to be necessarily congruent with the broader belief of scholars, with some, in the case of 9th century scholar Al-Tamidi, suggesting that this was a reward strictly reserved for martyrs, whilst authors such as 15th century As-Suyuti, writing in his work The Perfect Guide to the Sciences of the Qur'an, suggests that this was a reward for any Muslim who entered paradise. Such inconsistencies, if you will, have led to some dramatic interpretations over the years, where Jannah, the Islamic paradise, has been interpreted as a giant sexual orgy, where primarily men are seen as the beneficiaries. In some beliefs, most notably in the Hadith Sahih al-Bukhari, the virgins or women who serve this heavenly parlour are the Houri, or the Houri, divine beings created exclusively for the men as wives or companions. According to Ware's Arabic English Dictionary, the term Houri is a combination of two words, hur and ayn, and can be read as having eyes with an intense contrast of white and black. Hur can also be seen in the plural form, and can actually apply to both the masculine and the feminine. Here it is basically meant to identify a being who is distinguished by a certain luminosity, or lambence, that which gives the impression that these are good or pure beings. Meanwhile, Ayn refers to wide, beautiful eyes, which would render the Houri as pure or bright-eyed, or even pleasing to the eye. In his message of the Qur'an, polemist Muhammad Asad wrote, "The noun hor, rendered by me as companions pure, is a plural of both masculine and feminine, either of which describes a person distinguished by hawa, which latter term primarily denotes intense luminosity. In a more general sense, hawa signifies, as a moral qualification, purity. Hence the compound expression hurin signifies approximately pure beings, or more specifically, companions pure." We can simplify our understanding of the Houri by turning to the descriptions in the actual Qur'an, where the term is believed to be used a total of 4 times. Here though, described as merely maidens in the translation by Abdullah Yusuf Ali, or as hur, believed to mean women with fair skin in the translation by Dr. Muhammad Musin Khan, we are told of what one might expect to experience in Jannah. "We shall wed them to maidens with beautiful, big and lustrous eyes." Or, "We shall marry them to her, fair females, with wide, lovely eyes." Later in the Quranic text, we are given even more details about the Houri, and how the devout might experience them if they make it to heaven. "In them will be fair maidens, good, beautiful. Then which of the favours of your Lord will you deny? Maidens restrained, as to their glances, in goodly pavilions. Then which of the favours of your Lord will you deny, whom no man or jinn before them has touched?" And then lastly, in the final mention of these entities, we are told, "And there will be her, fair females, with wide lovely eyes, as wives for al-Mutakan, the pious, like the preserved pearls, a reward for what they used to do." Based on these descriptions alone, whether they are envisioned as regular maidens, or wives, or virgins, or whether they are envisioned as celestial female creatures, the Houri, the Qur'an isn't all that specific about the nature of these fair females or good maidens in relation to those who acquire them. Whether they are merely created for companionship, or whether they are created for sexual gratification, is not specifically stated. Now, one of the main arguments is simply that the Quran doesn't say these things are being made for sex, and so some scholars will have it that this is not what they are made for. One idea amongst Muslim scholars is that these maidens are made to be companions, and that in this realm of paradise where one has an abundance of fruit and rich carpets of beauty, the maidens are then just nice company to have. However, considering polygamy is allowed on the earth in Islam, it's unrealistic to believe that it wouldn't then be allowed in the afterlife, and a man could expect to receive more than one of these Houris to serve as his wife. You might also argue that as sex goes hand in hand with marriage, a devout Muslim might very well expect to receive this privilege upon his entrance into Jannah. Others do question that if the maidens are only merely companions, then why do they have to be women at all? Why do they have to be beautiful? Why do they have to be virgins? Why are they even married to the men in the first place? Sure, the Quran doesn't say anything about 72 virgins, but devout believers might find it hard to dismiss that they can still expect to be entreated by at least more than one female wife upon their reaching of Jannah. Now, this is only going by the English translation of the Quran. Indeed, many would argue that one cannot fully understand the Quran if they are not reading it in Arabic, the only language which Allah deemed rich and colourful enough to convey everything He wanted. Therefore, in order to combat the earlier points, I've seen some arguments that the Houri, or the Huralain in Arabic, is actually a gender-neutral term. As mentioned earlier, Muhammad Asad noted that the term Hur is a plural of both the masculine and the feminine. To add to this, scholars might say that when the Quran describes the Houri using feminine words, this does not automatically mean they are biologically female, because Arabic assigns grammatical gender to words whether they are male or female in reality. For example, the Quran describes humanity as coming from a single nafs, or soul, which in this instance is grammatically feminine, even though it refers to all humans, both men and women. So by this idea, the grammatical gender of a word does not necessarily reveal whether the subject is male or female, or in the case of the Houri, containing elements of both. What's more, another common argument I've seen put forth against the concept of the Houri is that whilst devout men get the benefit of enjoying their company, the rewards of devout women are nowhere to be seen. Some may choose to view this as a critique against Islam in general, putting forth that women are secondary to men, and that because their rewards are not mentioned, and because they don't seem to inherit any Houris upon their advancement to Jannah, if they even get there, then this is then confirmation of the bias. However, it can be argued that whilst men are framed as the inheritors of the Houri in the Quran, it does not mean that it was exclusively for them. In classical Arabic, the masculine form is often used as the default when talking about mixed groups or people in general, including both men and women. The Quran often uses masculine language when addressing all believers, not just males. Therefore, by this interpretation, it can be said that all devout people were entitled to be accompanied by the Houri, not just the men. Although this would certainly raise more confusion when we consider that these entities are described as wives. Surely the women would not be getting wives, but would actually get the equivalent in husbands, right? Well, more on that later. Another idea I've heard discussed is that our mortal perspective cannot translate to the perspective we would have in Jannah. In effect, one would not desire the same things in paradise that they do on the earth. In a realm where only purity can exist, it's unlikely then that one's sordid thoughts of harams, threesomes and beautiful fair-skinned women will ever materialize, nor would the devout wish them to be manifest upon reaching the heavenly precinct, for Allah is believed to purify the heart and remove such sinful thoughts. So in that sense, even if you were motivated by the idea that you were receiving beautiful, big-eyed maidens in Jannah, you probably wouldn't even want them when you got there. What's more, according to the 40 Hadith Qudsi, we see that Allah keeps for His followers such things that no one has ever beheld before, things that are so glorious and incredible that even the greatest of thrills of the mortal experience would pale in comparison. It reads, Allah will say to the inhabitants of paradise, O inhabitants of paradise. They will say, O our Lord, we present ourselves and are at your pleasure, and goodness rests in your hands. Then he will say, Are you content? And they will say, How should we not be content, O Lord, when you have given us that which you have given to no one else of your creation? Then he will say, Would you not like me to give you something better than that? And they will say, O Lord, and what thing is better than that? And he will say, I shall cause my favour to descend upon you, and thereafter shall never be displeased with you. In this sense, simply reaching Jannah and existing in this heavenly paradise will meet, nay exceed, anyone's expectations. There would be no need for Houri or maidens or anything of the sort, because the treats and rewards offered here by far trump anything that anyone has ever experienced before. This leaves me wondering then why the Quran doesn't just lead with this, instead of dangling the promise of silk clothes and endless fruit and pretty maidens. One idea is that this is intentional, that perhaps all these promises are meant to appeal to the 7th century audience and serve as the closest relative things that one could experience compared to what's waiting in Jannah. In that sense, everything the Quran says about paradise is merely metaphorical, perhaps even watered down so that our human brain can actually conceive even a fraction of what paradise will be like. In other verses of the Quran, Allah speaks about believers being paired with purified spouses when they reach heaven, which sounds awfully lot like the aforementioned Houri. While some suggest that these are two distinct beings, the likes of Muhammad Assad believe that they are one in the same, and could be conflated. He tells us, there is no doubt that the spouses raised high, i.e. to the status of the blessed, are identical with the Hur mentioned in Quran 56:22, above as well as in 44:54, 52:20 and 65:72. Of these spouses raised high, we are given much more description in the Quran. They are described as being full of love and well matched in both age and psychology of those that they are being paired with. The Arabic term atraban that appears when describing these beings implies that these are beings who are harmonious with the receiver. They might share the same interests and are fundamentally cut from the same cloth, so to speak. Ultimately, one might view them as a divine soulmate, a perfect being designed specifically to complement your own characteristics. As far as from what I've gathered from the original Arabic, there isn't all that much of a specific focus on the sexuality of these characters. After all, I can't read Arabic, and so again, the traditional Muslim would argue that I don't have the full understanding. Going by the English translations, however, things become a little less soulmatey and a bit more provocative. In Abdullah Yusuf Ali's translation, Surah As-Safat tells us in a description of paradise, and beside them will be chaste women, restraining their glances, with big eyes of wonder and beauty. Dr. Muhammad Muhsin Khan expands on this in his translation, where we are told, and beside them will be chaste females, wives, restraining their glances, desiring none except their husbands, with wide and beautiful eyes. To the average English reader, these verses are quite problematic. Not only are these women chaste, but they appear here to be created for the sole purpose of sexually pleasing their husband, and their husband only. In this idea that they restrain their glances, it implies that they do not have a free will of their own, or that they are so self-regimented that they fight against their own natural dispositions, so as to ensure that their husbands do not get suspicious, or jealous, or otherwise insecure. What's more, they desire none except their husband, which kind of treads on the earlier argument that there is no desire in Jannah, and that the things Allah has in store for man are so great that desire would be a moot point. Evidently, desire is still a big concern for the husbands who come to reside in Jannah, And whilst again, you might say that this is merely metaphorical from a purely textual basis, it becomes more difficult to reconcile. Again, why would a chaste female who cannot act upon her own free will be essential to one's idea of paradise? I also thought it quite interesting that they are described as restraining their glances in the first place, because it gives the impression that they are still finding other men attractive, and despite being perfectly created females, they still have to stop themselves from looking elsewhere, hence the verb restrain. Things take a more questionable turn by Surah An-Naba, where we are told in Dr. Muhammad Muhsin Khan's translation, "Verily for the muttaqin, there will be a success, paradise, gardens and vineyards, and young, full-breasted, mature maidens of equal age." Again, we get the idea that the women here will be of equal age to the receiver, supposedly making them more compatible. But the part about them being full-breasted may give some readers some pause. I've seen some argue that this is more of a vanity want, that the men will receive women with well-endowed breasts to satiate their own desire. This would then become something of a smoking gun in determining whether or not these women were sexual objects of fantasy, engineered simply for the male interest. However, if we consider the parentheses in this verse, we see Dr. Khan explain that this is in reference to mature women, in that the women that the devout can expect to receive will have gone through puberty, and would actually be women. Of course, to our modern understanding though, this is a strange way to go about wording it. Why not just say women and be done with it? Another issue here is that the women are described as being young, and yet of equal age to the receiver. Therefore, if an 80-year-old man dies, does he get an 80-year-old woman as a companion, or does he get a young woman? The English text alone isn't clear. One idea I've seen circulate is that when a man dies and reaches jhana, he is reimagined as a 30-year-old, or a prime age, and thus all the mature women, or the young women in this instance, would all take the form of 30-year-olds too. According to a hadith in Sunan al-Tirmidhi, the people of paradise shall enter paradise without body hair, with kohl on their eyes, 30 years of age or 33 years. From my understanding, the full-breasted description is disputed by some translators, with some choosing to replace this description with merely splendid or wonderful, or like the translation by Abdullah Yusuf Ali, choose to omit this part entirely. Having looked at the Quranic descriptions of the Houri, we understand that there is no mention of 72 virgins. The concept appears to be as alien to Islam as, well, aliens. Yet going by the English translation of the Qur'an, you can see where such ideas form their basis. Multiple women who have a restrained gaze and who are chaste, yet beautiful to behold, does sound like it emerged out of the mind of a man. Yet if we consult again with polymath Muhammad Asad, he would have argued that these women, these Houri, were likely gender neutral, and the reward for having this sort of companion could apply as much to women as it appears to apply to men. While such a notion remains to be disputed, various hadiths are far more concise and specific on the matter at hand. Whether or not the inhabitants of Jannah even engage in sex, or have the desire to engage in sex, still remains a contentious subject. According to the Quran, the residents of paradise will have whatever their souls desire, and whatever their eyes delight in. So by this understanding, you might assume that sex does transpire there, and men and women still do experience lust. In fact, if you individually wanted 72 virgins, and built your mortal life expecting them to manifest as 72 beautiful maidens, then by this belief, your desire would be actualized upon reaching Jannah. However, Jannah can also be understood as a transcendent state, where one can expect to experience spiritual bliss and certain contentment, something which might leave sexual appetite out of the equation altogether. If we were to consult certain hadiths meanwhile, Jannah can be portrayed in the same vein as a harem, where men can indulge in all of their sexual fantasies that they were incapable of achieving in their mortal life. Of these hadiths, the first that sticks out in my mind is Sunan ibn Majah, where we are told in a rather sexually explicit description, the Messenger of God said, "Everyone that God admits into paradise will be married to 72 wives. 2 of them are Houris, and 70 of his inheritance of the female dwellers of hell. All of them will have libidinous sex organs, and he will have an ever erect penis." As you can see, there's a lot to unpack here. First is the fact that everyone Allah lets into paradise will be married to 72 women. This doesn't appear to be an option, but rather a necessary rite of passage. Even if you're already married and or happily single, you now have 72 wives, 2 of which are Houri, which implies that these 2 are the most beautiful of the bunch, and probably the ones you'd be the most attracted to. All of these women will have libidinous sex organs, suggesting that they probably have a higher sex drive than you could ever imagine. And whilst you might not always be in the mood, your permanently erect penis will see to it that you can always seal the deal. It should be noted that Muslim scholars do have something of a scale for which to rate the legitimacy of the hadiths, ranging from the more reliable and likely sourced to the Prophet Muhammad himself or those who were around him, to the more dubious and untrustworthy. The highest and most trustworthy grade a hadith can receive is Sahih, meaning it has a trustworthy narrator whose words are reliable and contain no contradictions. The second grade is Hasan, believed to be good accounts, but with narrators with a slightly lower degree of memory or accuracy. The third is Da'if, meaning weak, and is generally characterized by its ambiguous origin and inconsistencies with the Quranic narrative. The last is Mawdu, believed to be a forgery or false narrative attributed to the Prophet, and generally dismissed by the larger Islamic community. As you might imagine, this particular hadith by Sunan ibn Majah falls into the category of the latter 2, a da'if to be more specific, whereby most Muslims actually do dismiss this particular section of the hadith altogether. In spite of this, there are scholars who, despite its penship in the 9th century, continue to perpetuate this idea. A century after this, scholar As-Suyuti also described Jannah with the same sort of imagery, framing the entire realm as something akin to a sex-riddled harem. He wrote, "Each time we sleep with a Houri, we find her a virgin. Besides, the penis of the elected never softens. The erection is eternal. The sensation you feel each time you make love is utterly delicious and out of this world. And were you to experience it in this world, you would faint. Each chosen one, i.e. Muslim, will marry 70 Houris, besides the women he married on earth, and all will have appetizing vaginas." From this, we gather that it isn't enough that the Houri is a virgin when one consummates their marriage, but that the Houri is constantly reimagined or redesigned, so that they regain their virginity each time the man wants to have sex. This speaks to the requirement of purity within Jannah. Everything must be fresh, it must be clean, it must be brand new in order to maximize the man's enjoyment. It also coincides with other hadith that describe the Houri as being incapable of menstruating, defecating, or even blowing their nose. Again, we see a similar description that the erection is permanent, but that the actual sensation of pleasure described here is said to be astronomical. Each Muslim will marry 70 Houris. Again, he doesn't seem to be given much of a choice here, on top of any other wives he had procured when on the earth. All will have appetizing vaginas, a pretty bold statement which you can make of what you will. In another hadith, Abdullah ibn Abi Awfa, an actual companion of the Prophet Muhammad, reported that the Prophet said, "Every man from the people of paradise shall be married off to 4,000 virgins, 8,000 slave girls, and 100 wide-eyed maidens of paradise. They shall all meet him within every 7 days. They shall say with their exquisite voices, no creature has ever heard the like before. We are the everlasting women. We never grow old. We are the refined women. We never grow sour. We are the ever-pleased women. We never anger. We are the sedentary ones. We never travel away. Blessings to him who is for us, and we are for him. Again, the rewards of the devout are increased even more in this example, with the number skyrocketing from 72 to well over 9,000. The submissiveness of the women is also highlighted here, with them being described as sedentary and never travelling away, almost making them sound more like servants than wives or legitimate mates. Yet another companion of the Prophet Muhammad, Abu Hurairah, when asked about whether a man will have sex in paradise, replied that a man will reach in a single day 100 virgins. Now, I mentioned earlier that Muslims have something of a grading system when determining the validity of these hadiths, and it's important to remember that, from my understanding at least, that while some of these writings can be viewed as weak or da'if, other words that the same writer uses can simultaneously be viewed as strong or hasan. That means you can't necessarily throw out an entire hadith because one part of it sounds a bit more outlandish or incongruent with one's personal beliefs. Rather, each statement must be scrutinized individually. Most Muslims would agree that the reports with these 72 virgins or 1,000 wives stem from weak and fabricated narrations. But then there are hadiths that are graded as hasan, the highest grade, that also explicitly mention this sort of arrangement. For example, in the book on virtues of jihad, narrator al-Miqdam bin Madiyah Karib tells us, "There are 6 things with Allah for the martyr. He is forgiven for the first flow of blood he suffers. He is shown his palace in paradise. He is protected from punishment in the grave, secured from the greatest terror. The crown of dignity is placed upon his head, and its gems are better than the world and what is in it. He is married to 72 wives, along with al-Huralain of paradise, and he may intercede for 70 of his close relatives." This then adds another layer of dispute within the community, where there are scholars who would argue that this is legitimate, as it had come from a companion of the Prophet Muhammad, as well as scholars who would argue against it being legitimate, with modern scholars like influential 20th century scholar Muhammad Nasir ud-Din al-Albani determining that the section of this hadith referring to the 72 virgins was unreliable. As we've already discussed, there is an idea within various Islamic beliefs that the Houri are gender neutral, and that when the Qur'an addresses men, it actually means to group men and women together. Again, this might differ by translation. The translation by Dr. Muhammad Muhsin Khan describes the Houri, or the divine spouses, as wives. They are most certainly women, fair females in fact, which might lead the average reader to view this as a reward for men and men alone. The translation by Abdullah Yusuf Ali, meanwhile, whilst less descriptive in this fashion, still refers to them as maidens, maidens who have not been touched by any other person, which again reinforces the idea that this is a reward for man. So if we read these Quranic verses at face value, and accept that men will be flocked with beautiful maidens, for sexual purposes or otherwise, can we then assume that women will be flocked by beautiful men, or a male equivalent of the Houri? Well, that's where it gets a bit more complicated. Many scholars point to the fact that based on the Quranic descriptions, Jannah will be a place where one can manifest whatever they want. Therefore, if this is to be believed, you'd think then that if a woman wanted a male Houri, or 72 males for that matter, then she could very well do so, even if the Quran and associated hadiths make no direct mention of this. However, you'd be hard-pressed to find such an idea being openly accepted, considering the lack of scripture surrounding it. One attitude I've seen floating around is that because women are typically believed to be more monogamous than men, Allah did not motivate them with the idea of, say, 72 virgin men. According to this idea, the woman would realistically only want for her husband, so appealing to her with an abundance of men in the afterlife would not necessarily goad her into becoming more devout, perhaps rather the opposite. Of course, this is a generalization by modern standards, but the idea seems to stem from the traditional view of relationships that frame men with more sexual prowess and the women with more submissive or shy traits. Seeking not to embarrass the women then, and allowing them to keep their modesty, the idea of 72 virgin men is therefore not offered to women. Perhaps not because the author writing the Qur'an didn't want them to have the same benefits as men, but because they assumed the women wouldn't want it. Saudi scholar Shaykh ibn Uthaymeen noted, Allah the Almighty mentioned the wives of paradise because men naturally seek them, which is not the case with women. Therefore, Allah did not refer to the husbands of women in paradise. But this does not mean that they will have no husbands there. Rather, they will have human husbands. This idea makes it a little more clear, and certainly attempts to even the playing field in terms of the rewards distributed to men and women respectively. What's more, the equality between men and women in Jannah is further emphasized by Shaykh ibn Uthaymeen, where he once said, if a woman does not marry in this life, i.e. is a spinster, Allah the Exalted will marry her off in paradise to the one whom she finds delight in. The Almighty will provide her with a husband who will delight her heart. Bliss in paradise is equally for both men and women, and it certainly includes marriage. Another idea I've seen circulated is that whilst the Houri are celestial beings created in paradise, the devout women and the wives of the men, upon entering paradise, either become one of these Houris too, made beautiful and perfect in the eyes of the husband, or are made into a leader of the Houri, almost like a royal overseer of the beings that now cater to the husband's needs. In a Hadith narration, which should be noted has been classified as weak by several scholars, it was reported that Salama, one of the Prophet Muhammed's wives, narrated that she said to the Prophet, O Messenger of Allah, are the women of this world superior, or the Houris of paradise? He replied, the women of this world will have superiority over the Houris, just as the outer lining of a garment has superiority over the inner lining. Salama then asked, O Messenger of Allah, what is the reason for this? He answered, because they perform their prayer, fasted and worshipped. Allah will put light on their faces and silk on their bodies. The human women will be fair in complexion and will wear green clothing and yellow jewellery. Their incense burners will be made of pearls and their combs will be of gold. They will say, we are the women who will stay forever and we will never die. We are the women who will always remain in comfort and we will never undergo difficulty. We are the women who will stay and we will never leave. Listen, we are happy women and we will never become sad. Glad tidings to those men for whom we are and who are for us. It's pretty difficult to come to a definitive conclusion about what one might expect if they were to reach Jannah, especially for women. Not only do the English versions of the Qur'an create some ambiguities regarding the purified spouses, but some key aspects such as whether they are made for sexual pleasure, whether they are metaphorical, or whether they are merely companions, is still widely debated. Certain hadiths only serve to add fuel to the fire, with some outrightly promoting the reality that one could expect to have his own personal harem, whilst others attempt to downplay or temper the more egregious expectations. In this sense, one's belief can be multifaceted, with some Muslims embracing these ideas and others rejecting them. But I'm sure you all have some thoughts and opinions that you'd like to share with me below. As always, if you found this episode helpful, then do leave a like for the algorithm and don't forget to subscribe. Until next time.